Thank you for joining us on ABC 10's In Focus. I'm Trent Bailey. I'm joined today by Congressman Jack Bergman. Congressman, thank you for joining me here.
Hey, Trent, great to be with you.
Okay, first off, you're 2 years in now. You just got reelected. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
When you first started in those 2 years, what was like the learning curve and what adjustments did you have to make once you got into Congress?
Well, let's start with the positive.
Yeah.
The positive was the learning curve was I knew I was going to have to build a staff, both here in the district and in Washington, D.C. And here in the district, I was fairly comfortable. In D.C., where am I going to get good people to populate my staff? I was blown away by the quality of the young men and women trying to get hired. They were so spectacular. So that was a really positive surprise. And when you go in to a body like the House of Representatives, I'm one of 435 winners, each with unique opinions. And how then do I establish myself as a functioning member of that body? And my first thought was, well, let's go meet some people. Let's go build relationships. It doesn't make any difference to me, Democrat or Republican. We got 435 people in there who were sent there by their constituents. So I just started shaking hands and introducing myself and finding out who they were.
And I imagine that's going into a job that's like no other. So when you actually start getting into those sessions in the committees and stuff, what is that like? Coming from, never been in that situation before.
Well, again, because in my last 5 years or so in the Marine Corps, when I was back on active duty as a general officer, I did countless committee and subcommittee hearings. I was one of the testimony folks, the ones before the committee. So, being there in uniform. So I'd had a chance to observe how committee hearings work. And quite honestly, I thought there was too much theater in it, because we would spend countless hours preparing for testimony, and then it seemed like some of the people, again, Democrats and Republicans both, we were kind of like the potted plant in the room of the theater. So I said, not knowing or not thinking I'd ever be back there, said, if I was up there, I would do that differently. So all of a sudden, I was in a position where I did it differently, to respect those people who had prepared that testimony, to listen to them and not make it some kind of a theater of pontification.
And after, 2 years in now, you got your feet solid underneath you, you know the ins and outs of it now. What do you know going forward that's going to help you with legislation or even forming relationships in that sense?
Yeah, well, number one, because I had not been a legislator before, my learning curve there those first 2 years was to learn the parliamentary process, the legislative process. And I relied on the staff that I hired, especially my legislative director, who was very steeped and knew the rules, knew what we had to do to introduce a bill, to bring it through committee, and all of those kinds of things. So I knew where my learning curve was that first term. Now it's my opportunity to continue as a sophomore in two roles, continuing to legislate wisely, but also now help the new class of freshmen get their feet on the ground. Because the key is the sooner you can get your feet on the ground, the sooner you can be productive for your constituents, no matter where you're from.
Right. And in your first 2 years, you sponsored and co-sponsored quite a bit of legislation.
I did.
And a lot of it focused on, especially with your military background, VA reform and protections for veterans and stuff. What sort of highlights do you see that came out of that right now that you can point at and say, I'm super proud of this?
Yeah. Well, I'm super proud of the entire Veterans Affairs community, because we hear too much about the partisan nature. Veterans Affairs is truly a bipartisan committee. Sure, we have differences, but we work for outcomes for the veterans. And the big picture piece of our legislation, amongst like 80-some bills, 80 bills were passed out of committee into legislation. That's a record number.
For any committee?
For the Veterans Affairs committee. Record for us, which means we got, as a committee, got stuff done for the veterans. But one of the examples was if you will, the reauthorization of the choice program that had failed so badly when it was initially rolled out. Providers weren't getting paid, appointments were getting canceled, all those things. So good idea, but poorly executed. So when we revamped the mission program here this last year, very definitive milestones that had to be met and procedures that had to be met to make sure that, number one, the veterans got the outcomes. But the other piece is the GI Bill forever. When guys like me went in the military and you got out, you had your GI Bill money, but it expired after 10, 15 years, whatever it was. So now it's GI Bill forever. So if you serve today and 30 years from now, you decide you want to use your GI Bill money to go back and use it, learn a new trade, it's right there.
Does that work retroactively?
No,
Okay.
it's going forward. One of the challenges, any program, I don't care whether it's Veterans Affairs or any other committee passing legislation, you have to be able to cost it out. And if you can't say how much this program is going to cost, because the American taxpayer is the one that pays for this, you have to be able to look every taxpayer in the eye and say, here's the cost of this program, and here's how we're going to pay for it. And that's there's a great book that was written by a gentleman who used to work on the Budget Staff Committee. We got a copy of it about 2 years ago. The High Cost of Good Intentions. And the point is, good intentions, passing it, but if you look 20 or 30 years down the road and we're still paying, was that the intended goal?
Right. And another thing that, especially during this last campaign season, another thing that you were a big part of is getting funding for a new Soo Lock.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the process that took?
Yeah, the process was very simple in that, not necessarily easy, but simple. 3 years ago when I started on the campaign trail for the first time, I identified the Soo Lock project as my #1 infrastructure project. So I started working that right away. But what we did was we put the wheels in motion. We got the president behind it, and he articulated it. We had the Army Corps of Engineers working with us, and then a couple of months ago when we passed the Waters of the U.S. bill, there was language in the authorization to reauthorize, or to authorize once again the Soo Locks, this time at about $922 million. And that was a huge step. We just got $32 million in the Army Corps of Engineers work plan for 2019. We just got notification of that in the last couple of weeks. We're working with the Office of Management and Budget right now to make sure that the language gets into the President's budget for 2020, which will take effect next October. But it's about basically just kind of keeping your eye on the ball, and we're watching it very closely. We've partnered with everybody from the President to OMB to the Army Corps of Engineers to the lake carriers, you name it. So we're just kind of keeping our eye on the ball.
Yeah, and that's something I wanted to know is, when is this going to go into effect? When are we going to start seeing construction? Because, as you said, some of these things, if it's the authorization, it might not even take place this fiscal year.
With the $32 million that we've got today for the actual beginning of the design and all the things you have to do on the front end, it's going to be a couple of years before shovels go on the ground. But we've never been this far before. That's the key. People need to know that we're going to take this through, we're going to run this through all the way to the finish line. But the idea is that
this has been something for like 3 decades or so.
1986. 1986. It was authorized a couple of times, but none of my predecessors stayed the course and continued to focus on it until there were actually shovels going into the ground. They got sidetracked doing other things.
And so obviously it's a long-term project at this point.
Yeah.
But when it gets done, what's going to be the immediate impact of that? Are we going to see a lot more shipping coming through the area? Or?
What you'll see is, we all want stability. And if you look at the lake carriers who transport the ore, largely in this case from Minnesota, coming out of the Iron Range, through the locks down into Lake Michigan or eventually into Lake Huron and down wherever it's going, that confidence that they're always going to have an open passageway there during the season then allows more planning. And when businesses can plan, they're going to provide more jobs longer term because they know they can count on the stability of that. There's not this fits and starts. And let's face it, if that lock shut down within 6 months, we'd have a recession. in this country because of the amount of ore that goes through there that ends up maybe in an automotive assembly plant in Tennessee. That plant's going to shut down when there's no parts to put those cars together. That's the reality.
And this is for Poe-sized locks, so it'd be like another one of like the large ones?
It's going to be, we'll whether it's the Sabin and the MacArthur that we combine, that's, their decision, but the size will be Poe-sized because that way it's redundancy. Because right now with the Poe lock, we're a single point of failure. If that lock goes down, the 1,000-footers aren't going through. So this now, what will happen here, this is a side effect that I've talked about with some of the engineers. We will learn some things in the design and construction of the new lock that then when we modernize the Poe lock, we will probably save money because of the things we learned in the new lock, because it'll be finish the new lock, then upgrade the Poe lock, and again, 2 locks, redundancy, and cost effective.
And speaking of waters in Michigan, and this is something that happens at the state level, but you've paid attention to this, the Line 5 issue and the tunnel, and if something goes wrong, that's completely in your district now on a federal level. And I know you are happy with the commission or the authority that Snyder just appointed to oversee the construction of the tunnel. What do you want to see happen there, and is there going to be any way to federally help get this going?
Well, I'm not so sure there's going to be a need for federal help on this, other than if there was some permitting issue that we needed to play a role in, because this is largely a state issue. And number one, I applaud Governor Snyder on his vision, and I applaud all the parties that came together to make this happen. Michigan Tech, especially when they did that study here about, 8-9 months ago, that kind of started the ball rolling, that people could see what a utility tunnel might look like. But think about this. The governor of the state of Michigan, no matter who it is, has responsibility for the safety and security of all the citizens in all of Michigan, not just below the bridge, okay? So what would happen if you were the governor, that something happened where the Mackinac Bridge shut down for an extended period of time for whatever reason, ice falling off at high winds, whatever, and you as the governor needed to move emergency vehicles either north to south or south to north? What would your plan be?
Go back to the old days when it was a ferry, I guess.
Yeah, and they don't exist, because that's kind of a fairy dust approach.
Yeah.
The point is, I'm happy to see that they're considering the utility tunnel. We're still early enough in the process. I've asked them to consider a tunnel large enough to run an emergency vehicle through if they needed to, a fire truck, an ambulance, some type of National Guard vehicle, because again, it is the governor's responsibility. You got the barge option, not too many barges laying around. You could drive it all the way around through Chicago and up through Wisconsin. That's not a good emergency response. No. So tunneling has been around for centuries. And we're not talking about any new science here. The question is, how big do you want it? What do you want to do with it? And do you need more than one?
Yeah, and that's something that when I was talking to state representatives for the area, I was asking them how big the tunnel is going to be, because maybe we need to lay something else under there. I just didn't know how big it's going to be, but that's interesting that you think this should be big enough for a vehicle to go through there.
Well, I've seen different, again, I've been studying tunnels since before we started talking about this. That's a long story as to why. I study unique things in my free time. I don't read a lot of fantasy. Yeah. But you have to decide, what is it we're trying to achieve? What is the cost of drilling, boring, if you will, because you build a tunnel boring machine based on the diameter of the tunnel you want. What is the cost of a 12-foot diameter as opposed to a 25-foot diameter? Roughly twice the size. You still got to bore through it. Maybe there's a little more. And maybe now this is where when you asked about the federal involvement or state involvement, there's a term in DC called P3, public-private partnership, where you say, okay, we're going to use state money, we're going to use federal money, we're going to use private money, and combine it to get the maximum bang for the buck. And that's going to be key in our transportation and infrastructure that we'll do in this country at the federal level, is getting the involvement of the private sector with the public sector to ensure that we get our bang for our buck and that everybody wins.
And I'll stay right in the water area. You and Representative Kildee from downstate co-sponsored a bill about the PFAS issue that's happening. It's affecting not just Michigan, but a lot of places in the country. You want to explain a little bit what is in this bill?
Well, number one, basically it just says, you know, without stating it, everybody deserves clean water. Okay. Now, how do we accomplish that, and how do we mitigate what's in the ground already? So this bill basically says the USGS, the U.S. Geological Service, the authority lies in them to do the testing, putting $50 million into this, and then they will work with the states. When a state like Michigan says, hey, I'd like you to come and test here at Wordsmith or at Sawyer or pick your place, and North Dakota says we want you to, you know, test here, you've got the states saying to a government entity, USGS, you've got the standardized testing capability, and then that way we have all the data flowing into one agency so we can compare and contrast to see everything from saturation to mitigation to, you know, what do we do? Because nobody intentionally put PFAS in the water. It was a high cost of good intentions, as I mentioned in that book title only.
Because a lot of it came from fire extinguisher.
Firefighting foam, which as a pilot, I always wanted to make sure that the airport I was taking off or landing at had good firefighting capability in case something bad happened. So again, the intentions were good, but now we look, you know, back and say, well, we didn't see the second and third order effects of using this particular product.
And you know, this is a good thing reaching across the aisle here because Congressman Kildee is a Democrat, and he's going to be like a deputy whip for the Democrats in the next session. What was it like working with him across the aisle? Because this is something that you guys both, obviously affects both of your guys' districts.
Well, other than the fact he's taller, and no pun intended, if he was listening to this, I'd say, well, I have to look up to you, but, you know, because you're taller. That was an attempt at humor, but that's okay. You know, the only thing I really feel bad for the American people for is that they don't see all the bipartisan work that is done every day in Washington, D.C. Democrats, Republicans working together early in the morning, late at night, all through the day. And this is just an example of a visible one where Dan and I have put this bill out there. But Michigan's got a really good delegation. All the representatives and our senators work together. We just had Governor-elect Whitmer into Washington, D.C. a couple of days ago to kind of do a little introductory meeting. And you know, we all work together.
And another big bipartisan bill was the Farm Bill that just went through, and I know that you voted for it, and Senator Stabenow was one of the people on the Senate side that was really helping author that with the Republican senator from Kansas, I forget his name now.
Pat Roberts.
Yes. And so yeah, these are things that don't get a lot of news all the time.
Well, they don't. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. You know, and we're a country, but especially as a state of Michigan, we make things, we grow things. And let's talk about the growing things. We need to make sure that our farmers who have made it their life's mission to provide food for others can actually do that and not go out of business. And there's a lot of things that go with that, and a good farm bill paves the way for them to keep farming.
And that was high numbers of yes votes on both the Senate and the House, so that was a really good one. So I want to change the subject here about kind of the economy and the budget right now.
Sure.
And I'll let you take your drink and we can just sit here for a second.
Okay, good. Yeah, you've talked me into dryness, or I've talked myself into dryness.
And so starting out about the budget, and this is something that concerns a lot of people in Washington and around the country and in Michigan here, and that our deficit hit a record high in November, and you voted for the tax cuts and the budget. So it seems like our revenue is going down, or not as much as it used to be, but our spending is still going up. we're outspending every single time.
I don't necessarily say the revenue is going down. In fact, if anything, it's it's the other way as you look at going to look at the year-end numbers here in 2018. But the spending is moving at a faster rate. We're not a country with a revenue problem. We're a country with a spending problem.
So how do we get that under control?
Well, here's a data point for you. You realize that every year, by the way, this data point is because I'm on the budget committee. Each year, our country pays out roughly $150 billion, with a B, dollars in improper payments. Somebody who's getting a Social Security check that passed away a couple years ago, check still comes. Somebody's getting a check for $1,000 that through a clerical error was supposed to be $100. Okay, add it all up, $150 billion in improper payments. Just think if we could cut a third of that, that would be $1 billion for every state in the union to do something with. We have to do, on the bureaucratic side, somehow create incentives and structures for within the agencies to go, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. Let's double check, why are we paying this? Okay, like any private company would do. They want to know where the money's going in and where the money's going out. Okay, that's number one. Number two, right now, 70% roughly of the federal budget is mandatory spending. So we don't do anything with it. It's on autopilot. Discretionary is defense, education, homeland security, other things like that. That's the only thing we negotiate. So unless we as a country cut our costs, whether it be cut the cost of health care, regardless, unless we start digging into that, deliver quality health care, but that we can afford to pay. There are too many areas where we as a country have not made tough decisions over time that have gotten us into this 20 trillion, if you will, in debt. But the example of when you talk about tax cuts, if you do the right numbers, you're going to cut some rates. But if you have more money coming into the economy, you have more money that is taxed. Okay? So it's not a simple A or B. You have to look, it's almost like an algebraic equation, if you will, that has certain components to it.
I mean, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, said, especially, at this rate, then in a few years, we're going to be so far in debts that we can't do anything about it. Why is there nothing, in the budget that just passed not that long ago, why is there nothing that's being said or done to say, all right, we can't keep going at this rate?
Well,
or if there is, how come we haven't heard anything about it?
Well, again, as a member of the Budget Committee a year ago, we passed a budget out of committee that had $203 billion in cuts to mandatory spending. That is what we passed out of committee. So we were starting to eat that apple just a little bit. We wanted more. Actually, we were trying for $500 billion, but couldn't get enough votes to get that. Went to the Senate and died. They wouldn't have any cuts. So somehow, the folks who take votes on behalf of their constituents in Washington, D.C. have to realize that it's not about a popularity contest. It's about making tough choices on spending. And you don't disadvantage one group to advantage another. So, and on the economist side, it's very interesting to hear economists talk about theory. As a Marine and a business owner, and as an airline pilot, I dealt in reality. So we got our challenges cut out, and it can't always be, I'll give you a little more. I'll give you a little more, because how do you pay for it?
And you talked about health care, and when you first ran in 2016, a big bullet point was, not just for you, but around the country, was repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, whatever you choose to call it. You know, and this is a district that is very much recipients. A lot of recipients in this state or in this district of not just the Affordable Care Act, but the Medicaid expansion that came with that. And then you voted to repeal those things, and we haven't had anything. I believe there was that first initial replacement that came up, I believe, in early 2017, maybe mid 2017, but nothing really that's came up since then to either start to fix the healthcare problem or a new plan for anything. What's the next step going this way? Because this is still a big issue throughout the country.
Yeah. Regardless of whether you repeal and replace Obamacare, we have a healthcare system that is not functioning for us. Was it 100% broken? No. Was it functioning to the point where it could be successful? No. So where do we modify it? Let's put it this way, when you take out competition, prices go up. That's just market. That's how markets work. No competition, price goes up because there's no competitiveness.
Yeah, but the president's also gutted some of the funding for it as well in the recent past. So prices are going to go up then. Like Michigan's, the average premium in Michigan is going to go up about 28% because of those fundings being gone.
Yeah,
and some people are going to get the subsidies to help with that anyways. But I mean, 28% or 27.6% is what the average is.
But remember, you're dealing under, those increases are occurring under Obamacare rules.
Well, if
Just
the,
so
if
you
the,
know,
if the
just-
funding was there,
There is not an endless stream of funding, but the increases, people, yes, we still are living under the Affordable Care Act. And some of those rules are driving what we're doing today. So you have to decide when you change something, can you identify what's broken and not working, and how do you fix it without destroying the whole thing? Example. Why is it that we can't work across state lines? Where I have 4 border counties in my district, okay? A lot of times their providers are in Wisconsin, okay? But we have limitations. Does that make any sense? It doesn't.
Not to me, no.
So yeah, and it doesn't, and that's where the old saying, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. In this case, okay, the initial goal, we said it's broken, we're gonna repeal it and replace it. That didn't work. So now let's take an honest look at what it is that's not working and how do we make it right. When you limit the market's ability to drive prices, and when I'm saying driving them down, because if there's no competition, mentioned a minute ago, they go up.
but even before the Affordable Care Act, prices were, the competition didn't make the prices go down substantially by any means.
I guess we didn't have it right then either.
No,
did
we didn't. No.
Okay.
But what do you think is going to be a first step going towards? We really need to look at fixing this. What if you had to go back, or in January when the new session starts?
Yeah, my crystal ball is pretty
Yeah.
cloudy, but because number one, after one term, I know I'm giving you the perspective of a 2-year congressman.
Right. Yeah.
So now when I go back, I will be a member of the minority. So therefore, then we'll see how the majority party puts their plan together. I'm excited about the opportunity to make some tough decisions that will make it better. I don't care what it is for the American people, whether it's healthcare, security, education, infrastructure. To me, I went there to work for the constituents of the 1st District, but for everybody. If there was one easy silver bullet answer, it would have already been done.
Yeah, and that's never going to happen. But,
No.
But yeah, I just didn't know if you thought,
and-
I can work with someone on doing this.
I
or
can
something.
work with anybody, and here's what may work in California or Florida or Maine may not be how we do it in Michigan. So I am a federalist. Minimize the size of the federal government and let the states figure it out. If you want a great number of one-size-fits-all solutions that really fit nobody, come to the federal government. They've got them sitting on the shelf out there. Okay? And we know that doesn't work.
Right. And being a federalist, you just touched on something that is inherently federal, is infrastructure. Now, this was something that is popular across the spectrum, political spectrum. Even President Trump ran on, I'm going to put billions of dollars into our infrastructure. has there been any improvements or bills passed in the last 2 years that even suggest that we're going in that direction? Because Michigan ranks really poorly as far as infrastructure goes.
You know, of course, why we have the interstate system, right?
For taxing purposes? I don't know.
No. When President Eisenhower was General Eisenhower, he saw the Autobahn system in Europe used during World War II to move military equipment across the country. When he became president, he looked at it, and now here we are in the Cold War in 1953, and he said, we're going to create the interstate system to make sure that we can defend ourselves, because now we were largely talking intercontinental ballistic missiles. That was the initial intent, and then to move commerce, not in terms of the old Chevy Chase National Lampoon vacation movies to put the family in the car and drive to Wally World. And that was not the intent of the interstate system. So just to be clear, so now when you think about infrastructure, have you heard of the pipeline interstate?
Of gas lines?
Well, any types of pipelines where you move fluids. When you think about if the decision for commerce, and we are a nation that grows and thrives because we do commerce. Even if we're hauling soybeans or beets, whatever, how do we do that? The idea is to get it from A to B, get it there safely, and control your costs. And pipelines of all sorts reflect the safest and lowest cost mode of transportation over the long term. But again, I study a lot of things that we talked before about, tunnels and all the different things. But when we look at infrastructure in our country, there's a balance between what the federal side does, what the state side does, so that Michigan is a great example of, think of our secondary and tertiary roads, a lot of them are gravel. We made that decision as a state. A gravel road in the right spot is a whole lot cheaper to maintain than it is some type of asphalt or concrete. Now, I'm not saying we go to all gravel roads. Some people say, we're going to do it. No, but the idea is wise decisions at the state level, partnering with the federal government where it makes sense, is going to be I believe, the recipe for success for the country.
All right. That doesn't answer exactly, like, why has there not been a bill that's came across on this, though?
Oh, well, if everything's the number one priority, nothing's the number one priority, but didn't we start with health care? Then didn't we go to taxes? Then didn't we go to there? You're going to see an infrastructure. We did a small, and it was more the FAA reauthorization bill. That really wasn't talking about roads so much. But we're still arguing about gas taxes. We're still arguing about all of those things, and how do we, I'm hopeful that the leadership in the 116th Congress will see fit to say infrastructure is going to be our number one priority. But that's their call. So that's going to be the Democrats' call here.
It just seems like it's almost a no-brainer, because in helping out the infrastructure, not just in Michigan, but nationwide, it seems to be a popular issue across the board. So it just seems like a no-brainer.
What seems like a no-brainer from the outside, it may not be so much of a no-brainer from the inside.
That's true. That's
true.
All right, so, we've talked now for quite a while. Is there anything else that's happening around the state of Michigan that has caught your eye right now?
Well, let's go back to the healthcare piece for a second. There are a lot of examples of different issues, healthcare being one, that I've said, if it'll work in the 1st District of Michigan, it'll work anywhere. Think about telehealth. Here in Marquette, we have the CBOC, the Veterans Clinic, that has instituted some telehealth, where if you're a veteran, you go in there, sit in a little room. There's a telehealth technician that hooks you up your blood pressure monitor and sticks the otoscope in your ear, and you're looking at a TV screen, and you're looking at your healthcare provider, who might be in Milwaukee or maybe somewhere else. We have an opportunity here, especially in the UP, to advance telehealth, not only that way, but also think of things like mobile telehealth, where it's the middle of winter and some person's older or whatever can't get out. So we have an advantage here, and that's a priority for me. Combine that with the Rural Broadband Connectivity Act, which I co-sponsored here a few months ago, that if we don't provide high-speed internet to our citizens, they're not going to be able to do their daily business.
It's becoming a necessity
Well,
now. for
it
everybody,
is.
yeah.
You know, when you walk into a room and turn a light switch on, you expect the light to come on. When you fire up your computer, you should expect it to be connected to the internet at a reasonable speed. We were over just south of the Soo here a couple of months ago and saw a demonstration of, it's called fixed wireless. And it's a new, they're not digging cable under the ground because, you know, that's very expensive
Right.
when you're laying the fiber. But a different way to use towers to provide that high-speed internet, using the white space, if you will, the spectrum that used to be used by the old ABC, CBS, NBC
Right.
news stations back when it was that spectrum.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm working on here in the 116th Congress as it relates to the 1st District, but again, applicable across the country, to make sure that our citizens are connected so they can do their business, and from the healthcare delivery piece, that they can get quality healthcare.
Yeah, it'll reach across platforms in
yeah.
that sort of manner. So.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I appreciate you stopping by. I've taken up a lot of your time now,
That's
so
okay.
thank you, Congressman,
Thanks,
for coming
Ted.
in.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and for the full episode, go to our website at abc10up.com. Thank you once again.
My pleasure.